Jasmine was arrested in September along with some of her alleged gang members on charges of murder, attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was out on bail when she was killed. Her family insists she wasn't involved in crime, describing her as a loving person who cared for her community.
It must stirred out of gold.
On October 28, 2020, a woman was shot 6 times in the town of Wentworth Township of Durban, South Africa, while sitting in the back of her Uber. People at the crime scene thought they'd witnessed a simple mugging gone wrong. But what they didn't know is that the victim in this incident was no ordinary woman. In fact, she was Simone Jasmine, the supposed godmother of Durban's drug gangs.
Jasmine's believed to have led a ruthless drug gang in Wentworth, Durban, which supplied heroin to townships around the city. She was laid to rest today after being shot dead last Thursday by a group of men. ENCA's Litiwe Mdluli reports.
Simone Jasmine once ruled Durban's underworld with fear and influence. Over the course of her criminal career, Jasmine was accused of murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. She ruled the streets of Wentworth with an iron fist, becoming a pillar of the community for some and a dangerous foe to others. But to truly understand Jasmine's rise to power and her eventual fall, we must first take a look into the place where it all began. Wentworth, an area south of Durban, with a complex history of apartheid and gang violence.
Wentworth, south of Durban. That's an area gripped by gang violence.
Drugs and a divided community, that's a recipe for disaster, according to some Wentworth residents who are in shock. An alleged female drug lord was murdered last week.
A Durban comedian is the latest victim in a series of shootings in Wentworth Township.
In other news today, a barrage of shots has been heard in the Durban suburb of Wentworth again.
Nestled in the heart of South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province, Wentworth was originally developed in 1938 by British colonialists as a military base and would undergo profound changes during apartheid, a time when communities were uprooted and reshaped under brutal legislation. The area's history is marked by the forced relocation of its minority communities and the rampant industrial expansion that has left Wentworth's residents fighting for identity and stability. With no other means of survival, many people in the area began trafficking drugs and other illegal goods, and by the early 2000s, Durban had become one of South Africa's largest heroin markets.
Drug manufacturing laboratory was established in the middle of a dense bush at the foot of a mountain several kilometers outside Groblersdal. Highly sophisticated drug and producing machinery. The head of the Hawks, Lieutenant General Godfrey Libier, says they received information from members of the public about the operation a few days ago. An extensive investigation by members of the Hawks resulted in the bust on Friday afternoon.
The production of heroin rose above all else, with multiple gangs, all vying for power and control. Caught between their gunfire were regular citizens, who were simply trying to live their lives in peace, even with it becoming increasingly difficult.
Wentworth has been battling gang violence for many years. Drug dealing is said to be the main driving force behind gun violence and gangsterism. Often innocent bystanders lose their lives when caught in the crossfire. The community says illicit drugs and revenge killings.
Simone Jasmine ended up among the bystanders who grew up in the midst of all this chaos. However, rather than becoming yet another victim of all the rampant violence, she chose to become a part of the dangerous game, making her way to the top. Growing up in a neighborhood grappling with poverty and systemic oppression, Simone's early life was far from glamorous. Seeing her parents struggle, Jasmine knew that if she were to ever break free from the struggles of Wentworth, she had to get her own hands dirty. And this started her journey in the criminal world. At the time, Jasmine was romantically involved with a man who had links with some gang members in Wentworth.
Years to stamp out a reign of terror by drug peddlers and drug lords. Chairperson of the community building credible organization, Stephen Beatty, says in some cases, children as young as 13 years old are being used as runners. He says practical steps such as rehabilitation of drug addicts are needed to stop drug-related crimes.
Through him, she began to gain her first insights into how the gangs in Wentworth operated, who wielded power, who harbored grudges, and which alliances could be exploited. These lessons proved to be quite useful for Simone because she wasn't content to sit on the sidelines. Her ambition was unmistakable, and she began carving out her own space in a world dominated by men. But it wasn't until her boyfriend died in a gang-related incident that Jasmine realized now was the time for her to truly come into her own. Unlike most people who'd retreat after someone so close to them was brutally murdered, Simone capitalized on the opportunity to gain control of the void left by her recently deceased boyfriend. And so, she began dealing drugs and laying the foundation for what would become her own criminal enterprise. Soon enough, she wasn't just the girlfriend of one of the gangsters. Instead, she made her reputation as the woman running the show. By 2017, Simone had founded her very own gang, called the Cartel. But as it quickly began gaining power, a ruthless side of the Queen of the South was beginning to show.
This is Wentworth. It's been plunged into poverty and plagued by gang violence. Bullet holes pepper the walls of the low-cost buildings where residents fear becoming casualties of the ongoing gang wars.
Under Jasmine's leadership, the Cartel became the gang that everyone feared the most. Her new base of operations was on Lansdowne Road, a complex of tenement flats called the Barracks. To outsiders, the Barracks was synonymous with Jasmine's darker persona, the Black Widow. She was the feared matriarch, the name whispered with dread by those who blamed her for the drugs and violence that ravaged Wentworth. But inside the Barracks, Jasmine was something else entirely. To the residents who struggled with poverty and unemployment, she was a hero, a figure of strength and generosity in a world that had abandoned them. She was the one who paid overdue electricity bills, ensuring families didn't have to sit in the dark. She delivered food parcels to struggling households, hired jumping castles for children on weekends, and organized birthday parties for elders. Mother's Day and Father's Day were grand affairs, catered with biryani, snacks, and cool drinks. But these benefits came at a cost. The other gangs weren't happy with Jasmine's rising influence, and this led the Barracks to become ground zero for weekly drive-by shootings. The victims of these shootings would sometimes be innocent bystanders who had nothing to do with the criminal underbelly of their town.
About nothing else but drugs. If you look at it, every young boy who gets shot, if we as honest parents look at it, we know that that person was selling drugs. We know that that area was selling drugs. This is what it is about gang related also, but some of them are not gangsters.
Jasmine knew that her actions would lead to the deaths of many, some of whom would be innocent, but that is a risk that she had acknowledged. To her, that was just the cost her community had to pay to fuel her ambitions. Under Simone's rule, for over 6 years, Wentworth was terrorized by gang violence. Consequently, the heroin market boomed as the cartel and rival gangs adopted more efficient methods to process and distribute heroin, such as packaging it into pill capsules. These capsules, known as caps, sold for as little as R$15 each, cheaper than a loaf of bread, and had become a lucrative business, fueling addiction and violence in Durban's poorest neighborhoods. But even with thousands of people suffering, the money the cartel was bringing in was simply too good to pass up. It's reported that Simone's gangsters would bring in almost $20,000 worth of profits daily, many of which would help to fuel Jasmine's investments, mainly her properties and Uber taxis. But rival gangs continued to feel that Jasmine was taking something that was rightly theirs, and continued to engage in violent conflicts with her, many of which would have deadly consequences.
The attackers then petrol-bombed this house. Stephanie Naidum was asleep with her 2 young children. She believes the main target was a neighbor who allegedly belongs to a rival gang.
Our clothes, shoes, our blankets, everything we lost. We couldn't save anything.
But despite the resistance against them, Wentworth very much came under the control of Jasmine and her gang, and so challenging Jasmine's authority often had deadly consequences. Those who dared to question her were taken out without hesitation. A licensed firearm carrier, Jasmine wasn't afraid to wield her weapon to make a point. Her network extended beyond Wentworth, bringing her into contact and conflict with rival gangs in other regions.
Police say the attackers stormed into a house at Q section in Umlazi just before midnight on Friday. They shot dead 2 occupants who were asleep and also shot dead 2 victims outside the house. The gunmen then proceeded to a nearby informal settlement, killing 2 people in a shack and wounding another.
One such rivalry exploded after a drug deal between the cartel and Umlazi's taxi-linked drug dealers went Wrong. Jasmine's gang allegedly killed a prominent Umlazi gangster, dumping his body in a field. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Members of the Umlazi gang sprayed a unit in the barracks with AK-47 fire, mistakenly believing Jasmine and her crew were inside. The continuous pressure Jasmine faced from rival gangs finally began to mount, especially when her own personal life hung in the balance. In the years following the death of her first boyfriend, she was linked romantically to 3 other gangsters. Each met the same fate, victims of the bloody turf wars that defined Durban's streets. These tragedies are why many of her foes called her the Black Widow, as it was a means of insulting her for the losses she'd endured. But things would continue to get worse for Jasmine. Just weeks later, a coordinated effort by the Anti-Gang Unit, Provincial Organized Crime Unit, and Crime Intelligence led to the arrests of Jasmine and several associates, including Kyle Pretorius, Tyrell Martin, and others. While Jasmine was granted bail, the rest remained in custody, fueling whispers of betrayal within the gang. Now, having lost some of her closest associates, Jasmine had nowhere to hide. So, despite taking extensive precautions, avoiding her own vehicles, using others to book e-hailing taxis, and never sticking to a routine, Jasmine could not escape the danger that loomed over her. And on October 28, 2020, she was ambushed minutes after boarding an Uber on Marine Drive.
Gun battles are common in Wentworth, with innocent bystanders often becoming collateral damage.
According to investigators, assassins had been watching her house for days. After making a U-turn to intercept her vehicle, they opened the passenger door and shot her at least 6 times, twice in the chest, 3 times in the stomach, and once in the leg. Jasmine died in the emergency room shortly after. 5 shell casings and 1 spent bullet were recovered at the scene.
A send-off fit for a queen. Friends and family of the late Simone Jasmine gathered on Marine Drive, The Bluff, where a fancy motorcade made its way into her home for a final goodbye.
Her death shook the entire community of Wentworth. For many, it was seen as retribution, a kind of justice delivered to the woman who had killed many people, both innocent and otherwise. But to her closest followers and her community, this was the loss of a hero, something that they would never recover from.
Her family insist she wasn't involved in crime, describing her as a loving person who cared for her community.
Even at her funeral, her family refused to acknowledge her crimes, claiming that the comments being made about her online were lies. It is certainly true that despite the criminal allegations brought against Jasmine, she never got the chance to stand trial.
It must stay out of gold. And see what's been published in the papers and all is not true. She wasn't involved in any murders, and you know, and she's never ever been convicted of anything. So I don't understand why people are talking a whole lot of nonsense and posting their rubbish comments on Facebook.
Jasmine's murder left a power vacuum in Wentworth, but it also left behind a trail of enemies. The cartel remains locked in ongoing wars with rival gangs like the Hollywoods, Drain Rats, G-Section, and Destroyers. Beyond Wentworth, Umlazi drug dealers had put a price on her head, and within her own organization, jailed members reportedly suspected foul play in her receiving bail while they were left behind. The fact is simply that Simone had made too many enemies during her time as the head of the drug business in Wentworth. While it's true that she was benevolent to her closest allies, once they started getting taken down one by one, she had no one left to defend her. In the end, while some choose to remember her as a tyrant who destroyed the lives of hundreds of people and exploited a community for her personal benefit, many others think of her as a heroic figure who helped them from the clutches of poverty. Simone Jasmine's story ended in tragedy, but the cycle of violence in Wentworth still continues. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the systemic issues plaguing Wentworth, poverty, unemployment, and the deep scars of apartheid-era displacement remain unaddressed. These conditions create a breeding ground for desperation and crime, ensuring that gang culture thrives. In the absence of meaningful social and economic reform, the void left by figures like Jasmine is quickly filled by others, drawn to the promise of power and profit in an unforgiving world. As Wentworth spirals further into chaos, one can only wonder how many more Simone Jasmines will emerge from its shadows. Without intervention, the community's future seems destined to repeat its tragic past, a cycle of violence, loss, and survival in a city divided by its own history.